Usually, I like to make my artwork super colourful. I like to use colour in my pixel art to make my work feel playful and cozy. But what happens if I only have 2 colours in my palette? Today we're going to find out how that goes by making a little 1-bit video game mockup and talk about the process. Let's jump into it. Hey, my name is Jade and I like to paint with pixels. Before we get into the drawing, I wanted to quickly start with the concept of the mockup. I wanted to make a sort of simplified version of a Dungeons & Dragons game, but with my little characters, where you'd use dice rolls to determine the success of your interactions, but there wouldn't be a ton of stats to keep track of. Kind of like Baldur's Gate, but really stripped back to the basics. I wanted to make this mockup for the Playdate, which is an awesome little device that I've seen that has a little crank on the side of it, and the graphics are all primarily in black and white. The screen resolution for this is 400 by 240 pixels, but for my artwork, I'm gonna half it to 200 by 120 pixels to go for a more retro, simplified look. I wanted this to look like the section of a game where you're exploring your surroundings and you're having a couple options where you can interact with objects in the scene. I played around with a few different options of sketches for where to place your party of 4, as you'll need to be able to select who is performing this particular action, and also where to place the dialogue box and the dice rolls. I ended up with a layout that was much more simplified than the first attempt, as it's a pretty small screen and I didn't want to overwhelm the player with too much information in one go. And you'll see a bit later how I try to mitigate that with the dice rolls as well. Now, onto our actual sketch. I wanted to start with the character profiles, as these had a specific set of features that I wanted to include, and I wanted to make sure that I had enough space to do so. Whereas with other areas such as the main environment, these are a bit more flexible in terms of their size and what they can show. Drawing these little character profiles took quite a bit of trial and error. I wanted to try and have some sort of base, like I normally would use for these characters, but I found it quite tricky to get that right. Since I was only working with 2 colors, I found myself defaulting to trying to outline everything, and then I'd struggle with a lot of the elements overlapping. I think, like in a lot of other cases for pixel art, focusing on the shape and carving it out from that, rather than using lines to define everything, can help a lot, especially with a limited palette. I wish that I did more of that here, and you'll see quite a few times where I'm having trouble seeing what lines are for what shape, because there's a lot of bits overlapping, and you'll see it a lot more when I work in the main environment on the left. But this is why I like to make these videos and reflect on the process, because now at least I know for next time when I try out some 1-bit art. It was quite fun thinking about which of my characters would fit each of the roles. As a quick introduction, we have Fern, who is protective of her friends, so I thought that she would suit a paladin or a warrior class. Lulu is a bit of a bookworm, so a wizard made a lot of sense for her. Lily is quite adventurous and can be sneaky, playing pranks on others, so I felt like she would fit the rogue vibes the best. And Daisy is always in her garden looking after her plants, so a druid was an easy pick for her. To try and condense the player profiles, I opted for using symbols for both the health and the spell slots. It felt pretty straightforward to use a small heart for the health, but for the spell slots, I sort of struggled a bit. I tried to go for like a spark or a burst of magic, but since these symbols are only 5 by 5 pixels, there is not too much detail you can do with it. Looking back at it now, it kinda looks like a snowflake. I wasn't sure if the extra features that I added for each character showed off their class enough, so I added a small symbol to each of the profiles to also show what class they are. I try to keep these very small too, as I wanted them to sort of just be an accent on top of the frame. I found that separating the lines between the main outline of the frame and the symbols helped a lot with making the symbols stand out more. It's a technique that I found myself using quite a lot throughout the piece. Next, I moved on to the dialogue box. I wanted to keep it pretty simple since I wanted the text to stand out the most, and reuse this dialogue box for multiple use cases, like for descriptions, but also for menus. So the only details that I added was a small border around the edge of the section. I also wanted to make sure that I had enough room for at least 2 lines of dialogue, so I made a simple font to test this out. As an example, I just wrote in the sentence for what you would first see in the mockup. For some context to the environment in the main screen, the party has just entered a storage room in search of a stolen artifact. I actually tried to block out this scene in Unity, which I've done before when I've been stuck on perspectives, and because I don't know how to use Blender. But even though this felt like quite a simple scene, with just a few crates and barrels around a chest, I was really struggling to get the perspective right on this day. I didn't use a lot of the composition in the end, but it was a good starting point for figuring out how the crates in the chest would be angled from the camera angle that we were viewing the scene from. Trying to define different textures in objects like the chest was quite difficult with only 2 colors. A big example of how I would usually do this in my work is in the wood background texture that I use for all of my videos. It uses quite a few colors to create sort of gradients and depth to the wood texture, but with 2 colors, you have to go for a very different approach. Later on, I did end up playing around with some dithering brushes to add to some of the shadows of the scene, but I think I could do the same with the textures as well. But I still think that the dithering helped with giving the room a bit more depth, especially around the floorboards. I found that sometimes less detail is actually better, especially for elements where you don't want them to be the main focus, like the stone walls. I kept thinking maybe I should add more detail to each of these stones, or maybe invert the colors so that they were mostly white like the floorboards. But I think only using lines to define the stones, and keeping a lot of that area plain, helped with making other elements that you actually interact with stand out a bit more, like the chest. Looking back at it, I think I could have broke up the lines even more around the edges of the scene, to help fade it into the background more and make it feel like the whole environment is a bit more dark. To try and minimize information overload by having too many elements on the screen, I thought it would be nice to have the dice roll overlay be something separate that we can lower into view only when the dice roll is needed. I tried to position it so that we can still reuse the dialog box to say what type of roll they need to make, similar to a D&D game where you would make a nature check, or in this case, a dexterity check with thieves' tools. I'd like to think if this was actually on the playdate, you could turn the crank each time to roll the dice. What could also be nice to add to this overlay is to decorate the border for each of the classes, to give the player a bit more indication of who is rolling the dice. So if the druid was rolling, they could have leaves around the border, or the wizard could have lightning bolts, and the rogue... I'm not too sure about the rogue, but I think it could be really nice detail to have some of those elements, and maybe even the dialogue box if they were talking, to change slightly if I were to build this up into a bigger project. With a couple of UI elements, and some animations, and maybe a bit of sound design. Here is the final result. And there you have it! I didn't want to spoil the mimic in the time-lapse section of the video, even though I showed this to my partner and they immediately asked, is the chest a mimic, without me even telling them anything. So maybe it was a bit of a giveaway. But it was a fun challenge to try and adjust what was already there into a monster that was a little scary, but still fit the cartoony vibe that I was going for. I feel like there was a ton of other things that I would add to this in the future, but I'm still really happy with how this looks, and I'm glad I could incorporate my little characters into D&D in some way. I think it would be interesting to maybe try out some of the other sections of the game, like combat or maybe traveling, and create separate short mockups for those. Let me know if that's something that you would be interested in seeing. I hope you enjoyed this video! If you enjoy world building in a fantasy setting, check out this video here, where we design a bunch of magical flowers for a fantasy world. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care out there. Goodbye!